Hey there, HorseCenter fans. Matt and I are back with another exciting edition of the show. Matt, this year we're talking about the 2020 Hall of Fame class.
Yeah, Brian, it's always a great topic to talk about the horses and people that got into the Hall of Fame this year and the ones that fell short.
Yeah, we're going to celebrate the best of the best right now. Watch it on HorseCenter. Welcome to another edition of HorseCenter, everyone. I am Brian Zipsy, and as always, I have the outstanding pleasure of being joined by my co-host to the East Coast. That's Matt Shipman. How are you today, Matt?
I am really good, Brian. Let's have a fun show and talk about the Hall of Fame elections that were announced on Wednesday.
Oh, Matt, that's a wonderful idea. With not a lot of big races going on right now, we just learned who will be inducted into the Hall of Fame this summer, the National Museum of Racing Hall of Fame right there in Saratoga Springs, Matt. And we had one horse, I think, out of the nominated horses that was really a slam dunk, as close as you can get to a slam dunk. Maybe not Triple Crown winner slam dunk, but Wise Dan, what he accomplished in his career, Matt, no one ever doubted that he wouldn't be a first-time Hall of Famer.
Yeah, that's for sure. Wise Dan put up some amazing statistics in his career and won so many awards. He ran 31 times, Brian, 23 wins, which included 11 grade ones and 19 grade stakes races in total on dirt, on turf, on synthetic, mostly on dirt. Won 6 Eclipse Awards. And actually, Brian, Wise Dan was the one that changed the way we vote for Eclipse Awards nowadays.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Matt. Let's go back a little ways. First off, the son of Wiseman's Ferry, a gelded son of Wiseman's Ferry on the racetrack, was owned by Morton Fink and trained by Charlie Lopresti. Matt, believe it or not, I probably told you this, but I was there when he broke his maiden. It was a spiral day at Turfway Park, making his second start, and his first race he had gotten to the lead and gotten past, but not on this day at Turfway Park. Second race of his life, he ran fast. He won that maiden special weight at Turfway Park on Jim Beam Day. By more than 15 lengths. I guess we're going back 10 years now to when I first saw Wise Dan, and I had the pleasure of seeing him a lot of times since then, Matt. And 2 starts later, 2 starts after that maiden special weight win at Turfway Park, he was winning a big sprint stake at Keeneland, the Phoenix Stakes, an important sprint stake at Keeneland against older horses. And propelling him that race, in which I remember he kind of had to bull through horses a little bit, wait for room, and 4th lifetime race, he got into the Breeders' Cup Sprint, a dirt race, off his big win on a synthetic.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear you describe that, Brian. That early on in his career, they hadn't even figured out what it turned out that he would do best.
Yeah, and of course he didn't win the Breeders' Cup Sprint in only his 5th lifetime race. This is a 3-year-old that again won a maiden special weight at Turfway Park just a handful of months earlier. So he really showed his class early on, but it was sprinting, and it was sprinting on either dirt or there were a lot of synthetic surfaces here in Kentucky back then. So Turfway Park and Keeneland. But then the next year, Matt, he was primarily, again, synthetic surfaces or dirt surfaces. And he was a nice horse as a 4-year-old. But later in that year, he really got good. And by the end of the year, you could say he was one of the best handicap horses, not on turf yet, but one of the best handicap horses in the country. He did make a couple of very good turf starts. His first 2 turf starts came at 4. But when he won that Fayette at Keeneland, much like Tom State-Tot did last year, when he won that Fayette at Keeneland by open lengths, and then the Clark at Churchill, one on synthetic, one on polytrack at Keeneland, one on dirt at Churchill, you knew that he was one of the best horses in the country.
Yeah, and hey, you can't blame Charlie Lopresti, right? He was going so well and doing winning so many big races not on the turf, why go anywhere else?
Yeah, and like I said, he made a couple good starts in his 4-year-old year on the turf. And even at 5, it looked like he might still be a handicap horse or a dirt male for lack of a better classification. I remember that Stephen Foster, where he was beat up pretty bad in the race, where he got really bumped hard, and Ron the Greek, a really nice handicap horse, just barely beat him in that Stephen Foster 2015. That was the race that may have turned the tide to bringing him back on turf, Matt. Had he won that, coupled with the Clark win, and I think he won a race at Keeneland on the poly track still, I guess it would have been the Ben Ali back then. He won the Ben Ali by more than 10 lengths, but when he lost that tough race where he was really bothered in the Stephen Foster in June of his 5-year-old season, that's when we switched to turf, and from there he just took off.
Yeah, there's no question about that, Brian.
Yeah, Matt, turf races, I was talking about the Stephen Foster where he was bothered, but he had 15 more races after that, and 14 of them came on turf, and one of them came on a synthetic surface, and that was a race, of course, the Shadwell Mile, I believe it was, where it was taken off, and he could never catch that speed horse Silver Max, who ran a huge race that day. Wise Dan was the only one that got close to him, but that was his only loss. So after switching back to turf, after that tough loss in the Stephen Foster on dirt at Churchill Downs, he ran 14 more times on turf, and he won all 14 of them.
Yeah, pretty absolutely amazing, and certainly it was in those years that Wise Dan won his 2 Horse of the Year titles. He won his 2 Breeders' Cup miles on the turf. He in those days, as I mentioned earlier in the show, those were the days when you could actually win 3 Eclipse Awards in a year, and Wise Dan did that as Horse of the Year, as the best male turf horse and the best older male, and that was after that Wise Dan domination. That was when the older dirt male category was created.
Yeah, he has to be in the Hall of Fame. He changed the rules of the Eclipse Awards, right? That the reason, Matt's exactly right. The reason that they started calling it the Older Dirt Male Award is because Wise Dan was dominating both divisions, even though he was by then strictly a turf horse, Matt. He won 7 big turf races, the middle distance turf races. He won 7 of them multiple times. Of course, the Breeders' Cup Miles, he won 2 years in a row. He won the Woodbine Mile. He dominated the races in Kentucky, like the Firecracker and the Shadwell Mile. And again, kind of putting on an end note on this, I was there for his final, what turned out to be his final race. We didn't know it was his final race. We figured it was getting near the end, but that was a Shadwell Mile. And when he really kicked it in late, he looked like he might not get there in mid-stretch, but he kicked it in late. That was one of the more touching, more joyous crowds that I've ever been a part of, is when he rolled late in the Shadwell Mile, and that was his final race. Of course, he had been sick earlier that year. This is now his 7-year-old year after his Eclipse Award domination at 5 and 6. And then he was injured getting ready for going for a 3rd Woodbine Mile, and then after that it would have been a 3rd Breeders' Cup Mile. But Lepresti and Fink pulled the plug on that. They said, no, even though he's a gelding after this injury, there's no point in running him more. 19 graded stakes wins, Matt. You said the number of grade 1 wins. Wise Dan, an obvious choice, a happy choice. He's still Charlie Lepresti's farm now as a gelding, as an older gelding. I guess he would be about 13 years old now. Wise Dan enters the Hall of Fame, Matt. And that left a lot of horses, because he was the only modern horse who did get into the Hall of Fame yesterday. There were several mares on the list, and a couple of old-timers from California who ran for years. None of them got in. I'm gonna list them off real quick, Matt, but we'll talk a little bit about them. Blind Luck, and of course you can't say Blind Luck without saying Have It Grace. Rags to Riches, the Belmont winning filly. Kona Gold, that sprinter who was around for years. And of course, Game On Dude, one of the most popular horses in California in this century. Let's start with the fillies and mares, Matt. For my money, the rivalry between Blind Luck and Havre de Grace was the best American rivalry we've had in a long time.
Yeah, that is for sure. In the early part of last century, in 2010 and in 2011, they met a whole lot of times, and Havre de Grace did not get beat very often. But when she got beat, it was often with a late running charge from Blind Luck.
Yeah, they actually raced 6 times together, Matt. Let's go over some statistics. I'm going to go back and forth between the two because they're so intertwined in history. Havre de Grace was a little bit later to the party as far as top-notch racing. She didn't debut until 3, but of course Blind Luck was an excellent 2-year-old filly. I personally thought she should have been a 2-year-old filly champion back in the day. Blind Luck won 10 graded stakes. Havre de Grace won 6 graded stakes. Havre de Grace was 9 out of 16 lifetime. Blind Luck was 12 out of 22 lifetime. Blind Luck in the rivalry won 4 out of the 6, Matt. I am a Hall of Fame voter, Bat, and I got to tell you, it was hard to decide on some of these horses after Wise Dan. I actually voted for Blind Luck, and I didn't this year. I didn't vote for Havre de Grace.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's so hard to separate them, and to Havre de Grace's credit, she was named Horse of the Year, and she did beat the boys in the Woodward at Saratoga. So those are a couple of things to her credit that we don't get to say about fillies and mares in our country very often.
Yeah. Havre de Grace had a great fall. She lost the Breeders' Cup, of course, but she won that Woodward. And interestingly, Matt, she was the favorite in that Woodward, coming off a loss to Blind Luck. So that's how good Blind Luck was. Blind Luck was retired after beating Havre de Grace one final time. Havre de Grace went on to win the Woodward. Again, she was favored against males. She won the Beldame by a lot, and she got the Horse of the Year that year. But Blind Luck, I tell you, 4-6, Blind Luck won, and she gave Havre de Grace 10 pounds in one of her 2 narrow losses to Havre de Grace. 2 great mares, though. As was the 3-year-old filly Rags to Riches, Matt. We're coming to a point in history now where I think longevity is going to be a hard thing to really penalize a horse for too much, or lack of longevity. Because you have horses like Rags to Riches, you have horses like Arrogate, you have horses like Justify, who really just unfortunately weren't around very long. But I think what Rags to Riches did in dominant wins in the Las Virgenis, the Santa Anita Oaks, the Kentucky Oaks, and then that brave victory after stumbling to her knees in the Belmont Park, in the Belmont, to beat Curlin in the Belmont Stakes. That 4-race streak is about as good as it gets for any filly that I've ever seen. Unfortunately, she never won a race after that Belmont, but that 4-race streak was pretty incredible.
Yeah, it certainly was. And of course, we're talking about a Todd Pletcher trainee, and she was the 3-year-old champion in 2007. Only 7 starts, like you mentioned, Brian, 5 wins. Obviously, one of them was her maiden score. And then the other 4, Brian, all grade 1s, including the Belmont Stakes.
Yeah. And you know, you say 5 to 7, and that doesn't sound that great, but the first race was her first race of her life, and the last race she got hurt in, where she was second in a stake that fall at Belmont Park. So, yeah, who knows how good Rags to Riches could have been if she remained healthy. But again, that 4-race streak, something special. And I think the one thing you got to remember about Rags to Riches, another one I did vote into the Hall of Fame. She was on my ballot as one of the ones I voted in. She's the only filly in more than, I guess it's been more than 110 years now. She's the only filly to win the Belmont Stakes, and she did it over Curlin. So something special there. Kona Gold, Matt, 14 wins in 30 lifetime starts. He set a track record while winning the Breeders' Cup Sprint.
Yeah, we're talking about sprinters here, and it's tough. Let's face it, Brian. It's tough for a sprinter to get into the Hall of Fame when we're talking about horses that have won classics and triple crowns and horses of the year. It's just tough for a sprinter to get in. But this California-based horse, this was one super fast horse, Brian. 10 wins out of 30 starts, but in those wins, Brian, buyer speed figures over 110, 10 times, and his highest buyer speed figure. Horses nowadays don't run those kind of numbers.
Yeah, and I look at him a little bit like I look at Safely Kept. Kona Gold won 14 of 30 starts. Safely Kept she got into the Hall of Fame recently. She had a much better winning record. Of course, she was running against Phillies in a lot of those races. Kona Gold was brilliant there for a while. Track record in the Breeders' Cup, that says something right there. But he was also among the best for years and years. So yeah, sprinters are always going to have a harder time to get in, but Kona Gold certainly is a worthy horse to talk about. 5 straight times he ran in the Breeders' Cup Sprint. That's not easy to do, man. And speaking of longevity, we got to talk about Game On Dude, who joined Wise Dan as a new nominee this year. So he got on the nomination ballot in his first eligible year, which could bode well for him in the future Hall of Fame votes. But he did not get in this year, Matt. I didn't quite vote for either Kona Gold or Game On Dude, but I certainly considered him. After Wise Dan, again, I thought I was splitting hairs a little bit. Game On Dude won 14 graded stakes races.
Yeah, just to rattle off some of the impressive things in Game On Dude's career, the Bob Baffert runner. So, he was an extremely popular horse with fans because of what he did on the track and because he was a Bob Baffert runner. 16 wins overall, over $6 million won. He's the only horse to have won the big cap at Santa Anita 3 times. In 1 year, he won the big cap. He won the Hollywood Gold Cup, and he won the Pacific Classic. A lot of things on the positive side for Game On Dude, but others will point out that there are some glaring omissions in his record, in that he was never a champion and he never won a Breeders' Cup race.
Yeah. Maybe he had the disadvantage, unlike several on this list, of only running in the Breeders' Cup Classic, which could be the toughest of all the Breeders' Cup races to win, which probably is the toughest of all the Breeders' Cup races to win. So Game On Dude was thrust into that. He also never really made a big splash outside of California, but you got to respect what he did in California. Again, 14 graded stakes wins, 3 big caps. Some of those races he was just so dominant in. That Pacific Classic he ran was just out of this world. So Game On Dude, I think he's a horse that could get into the Hall of Fame, even though it didn't happen this year. All right, Matt, Wise Dan stands tall above the other current nominations for the Triple Crown, but Blind Luck, Havre de Grace, Rags to Riches, Kona Gold, and Game On Dude certainly all have a chance in future years with strong resumes. Speaking of strong resumes, the only human I voted for this year, the only one, there were 5 nominees: jockey Corey Nakatani, trainer Christophe Clement, Doug O'Neill, David Whiteley, going back a few years, and then, of course, Mark Casse. Mark Casse was the only one I voted for, Matt, and Mark Casse was the one that made it in this year. I thought he had a chance to make it in last year, but then he kind of pushed himself over the edge with what he did in last year's Triple Crown.
Yeah, like you said, Brian, this I think was his second year on the ballot, and he's got some impressive statistics over his lengthy career. For a lot of his career, he won an awful lot of races in Canada at Woodbine. He won the leading trainer title there 11 times. He won a whole slew of sovereign awards. Those are the awards in Canada for of merit for horses that race in Canada. He's ninth all-time earnings of trainers in North America. But Brian, the last 4 or 5 years, Mark Casse has amped up his training game and has become one of the best in the U.S.
Yeah, well, he's been around for a long time, and to be named the Trainer of the Year, that get the Sovereign Award for Trainer of the Year 11 times in Canada, I think says a lot. Matt, he trained 18 different millionaires. That is an accomplishment, even in today's racing where millionaires are a little bit more common. 18 of them, so he's had great horses who have done big things over the years. Let's just run them down a little bit. I think the first horse I think of, and maybe most people think of when they think of Mark Casse, is Tappan, and Tappan just was a really nice young filly who just skyrocketed at 4 years old, and of course she was a multiple Eclipse Award winner. Tappan, a great mare. Tappan, he took to win the Breeders' Cup. He won the Woodbine Mile more than once, but he also took to Royal Ascot to win. And of course, that's something that American trainers or horses haven't done much. Besides Tappan, Classic Empire, maybe the best dirt horse he's ever trained. War of Will, the Preakness winner, who's running Saturday, making his return after not running since the Breeders' Cup Classic last year. World Approval. Sealy Hill was another Canadian champion that I really liked. Wonder Gadot had a big run. Catch a Glimpse was a Breeders' Cup winner. Uncaptured was a champion in Canada. Lexi Lou. So not only has he won a bunch of Breeders' Cup races in the last 5 years and 2/3 of the Triple Crown last year, but he won oodles of Triple Crown races in Canada as well.
Yeah, and his total wins, he's quickly approaching 3,000 wins. He'll probably get to that important barrier within a year or so. He's won 163 graded stakes races. So and he is ninth all time in earnings in North America.
Ninth all time. That's an impressive figure as well. He's been around for a long time, but in the last maybe 15 to 20 years in Canada, and especially the last half dozen years in America, he has truly become a great trainer and a deserving Hall of Fame member. Matt, I had the pleasure of seeing him in the backstretch multiple times, getting to know him a little bit here and there at different tracks, also interviewing him and spending a full hour with him on camera for a roundtable that we did one year with him and his son Norm. Really a stand-up guy, an honest guy, a sincere guy, and one of the easier guys to like and to talk to on the backstretch as well. Mark Casse's made a name for himself, I think, as the kind of person he is as well, Matt. And recently he's stood up for anti-doping. He's put his name out there as one of the strongest guys against clenbuterol, for instance, as something that horse racing absolutely needs to get rid of. And for that alone, I think Mark Casse, it means more coming from a Hall of Famer or a guy who is about to be in the Hall of Fame. But Mark Casse really stood up for the good of racing, the good of the future of racing.
Yeah, without question. And you can't minimize that, Brian. His performance, his record, his titles on the racetrack, both in Canada and the U.S., are so impressive. But as you said, stand-up guy, the kind of person that we want in the Hall of Fame, representing thoroughbred racing. And like you said, Brian, I've had the opportunity to talk to him on a number of occasions also. He's generous with his time, and he's generous with his horses. He's one of those guys where he says, oh, yeah, you want to go say hello to Tappan? You want to go say hello to this horse? They're right over there. Go ahead. Where other barns and trainers are a lot more standoffish. So congratulations to Mark Casse.
Yeah, I'm super happy for Mark Casse and Wise Dan, of course. What a legend, especially here in Kentucky, Wise Dan was. So it's nice to see both of them get in. Overall, there were 7 new inductees into the Hall of Fame, Matt, and a lot of these are either a little bit from the past or what they call the Pillars of the Turf. Pillars of the Turf included George Widener Jr., who of course was a big owner and breeder back in the day. He was also the chairman of the Jockey Club for years. Alice Headley Chandler, Matt, was the matriarch of Millridge Farm, and among her many accomplishments at Millridge was the breeder of Sir Ivor, who of course was an amazing American-bred horse who did amazing things in Europe and then became a top sire in his own right. Keen Dangerfield Jr. I'd never heard of before, but steward all over the country of renown. Tom Bowling, looking at the historical members to get in, Tom Bowling, another one that I never heard of, Matt. Everybody talks about how I'm so into the history of racing, but Tom Bowling I didn't know about, but he was one of the best horses from the 1870s. So we're going back 150 years to finally get Tom Bowling into the Hall of Fame. And then on the human side, in the historical review category, Darryl Mcharg. And Darryl Mcharg is a guy I got to know a little bit after the fact, but I tell you what, when I was growing up, he was absolutely one of the best jockeys, Matt. His career didn't last as long as some, and I know he went over to Europe even for a little while, but in the 70s, Darryl Mcharg was one of the top jockeys in the country.
Yeah, that's for sure. He had a run in there in the late 70s and in that golden decade that we've talked about before, where he won a heck of a lot of races, four close to 500 races in a couple years there, primarily out in California, where he still works in racing. He is the chief steward of racing in California.
Yeah, and he rode John Henry to a bunch of stakes wins out there. A number of top horses, mostly in the 70s or early 80s. General Assembly comes to mind. He rode, he was an Eclipse Award winner back in, like you said, right smack dab in the glory days of racing there, affirmed Alydar, Triple Crown year, spectacular bid. Darryl Mcharg was among the best. The two things I remember most about him as a jockey was Vigors. Vigors was that sensational gray horse that just got so good one spring in California on the dirt, and Mcharg rode him every time as he was mopping up horses from way back, a near white horse. In fact, they called him the White Tornado, and that was Darryl Mcharg aboard him. I also remember early on, I remember a Preakness, and it was one of the years where I was just old enough to really, really get into racing. I was, a crazy kid about racing. And I always liked a horse called Master Derby, and that happened to be Darryl Mcharg's only Triple Crown win. But I remember how game he was in beating the Derby winner, Foolish Pleasure, Darryl Mcharg aboard Master Derby. So that's it, Matt. That's the 7, led by Wise Dan and Mark Casse. You told me beforehand you didn't think a lot of modern ones were going to get in. I voted for 4 of the modern nominees, and 2 of them got in. The two that got in were 2 I voted for, Wise Dan, Mark Casse. I think certainly deserved it. I think a few more of these horses, especially, and the humans as well, but I think a few more of these horses will get in as we look forward. Can I get a parting shot from you on this Hall of Fame show, Matt?
Sure, Brian. I had the opportunity one year to go to the induction ceremony up in Saratoga, and it's a really neat ceremony, because any of the Hall of Famers from the past, that people obviously that are around, or come up on stage and get recognized. It's a cool thing. Obviously, I don't know what they're going to do this year with it, but in the future, folks, it's something you should do. And if not, of course, visit the Hall of Fame itself, which is getting renovated right now up in Saratoga.
Yeah, and that is one of my favorite places in the world to visit. I'm not always as big on artwork or things like that. I enjoy going to other museums, but take me to the National Museum of Racing right there across the street from Saratoga, Matt, and I'm happy for hours on end, because it's just a wonderful place to visit. If you like the history of racing at all, you like these horses you've been watching for the last 10, 20, 30 years or more, you got to visit the Hall of Fame. And if if you haven't done it, you'll probably want to go back more than once. Hey, Matt, I want to thank everyone out there watching. We appreciate you watching every week on HorseCenter. We've got a lot of big races coming up. Next week, we're going to do our brand new, we haven't done this in a while, Matt, a brand new Kentucky Derby rankings, where we're going to talk about all the biggest races that have happened generally in the traditional preps for the Kentucky Derby, which would have already been run. But of course, Matt and I are going to run down our rankings now that are geared towards the first Saturday in September. If you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel here on Horse Racing Nation, please do so now. I want to thank our producer, excellent producer, Brett Workman, and our super sponsor, the best contest site out there, Derby Wars. Say goodbye to everybody, Matt. You're closing this week.
It's my pleasure, Brian. Everybody take care of yourselves and be safe. We'll see you next week on HorseCenter.